So welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies and also the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Cornell. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Cornell University's campus, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gaia-Kahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gaia-Kahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gaia-Kahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gaia-Kahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Averill Schmidt. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and in the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy here at Cornell. He studies international relations with a focus on the politics of international law and organizations, and received his PhD from Harvard University in 2024, joined us in 2025, yay, we're so lucky, after completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University. So please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
So it's very exciting for me to be back here. I guess my first talk at Cornell was actually at Reppy, in which I presented some research on how international institutions affect patterns of violence between states. And today we're going to look at how international institutions affect patterns of repression and violence within states. It's kind of all consistent here with violence. So for those of you who read the paper, I guess I'd like to flag from the outset that you saw kind of the initial draft of the paper that I submitted to a journal, and I've since received an invitation to revise and resubmit it. So there's some changes that will be reflected in the presentation, and I'll try and flag those things as we encounter them. Part of my kind of like self-interested goal with this presentation is to use you all as a gut check to see if the changes that I'm making are persuasive and like help contribute to the argument. And I'd say you should feel free to interrupt me. Maybe if you have like super substantive questions that are going to bring us down to tangent, you can hold on to those until the end. I always find it awkward to talk for 35, 40 minutes straight. So if there's like clarifying questions or anything that comes up, you should feel free just to fix them. All right. So there's kind of a long-standing debate in the international relations and comparative politics literature about whether or not international institutions, international laws, and monitoring efforts in particular can contribute to the advancement of human rights. So there's kind of older research that really begins in the 1990s with this literature on the role of transnational advocacy organizations. Things like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, that try and document whether or not these efforts to kind of name and shame countries that are violating human rights can actually contribute to the advancement of human rights. So there's 2 kind of bases of the argument here. One is that this effort to publicize transgressions really increases costs of non-compliance. And then there's more of a sociological based literature about how when actors get confronted by international institutions, they can learn best policy practices, be socialized into international norms and customs, and then generally, embrace more liberal democratic practices. More recently, there's been some pushback on these initial findings by a variety of researchers. I'll broadly characterize these as the critics and the optimists. And the critics have recently shown that there can actually be some pretty severe unintended consequences to states being targeted by international monitors, right? So it can lead to politicization of human rights and can prompt cases of backlash when states like double down on their abuses or refuse to reform because they don't want to be seen weak in response to international monitors. So I think there's kind of 2 big problems with this debate, or 2 kind of like obstacles to being resolved that I'm trying to address in this paper. So one is that a lot of this research is really confounded by issues of selection. So if you think about the process by which states come under international scrutiny, it's often precisely the states that are engaging in human rights violations, right? So if you're going to be targeted for violating human rights by international monitors, there's probably something else going on that really creates difficulties in trying to disentangle the impact of the monitors themselves versus the kind of the underlying process that leads these states to be targeted in the first place. And then I think the second big issue is really a matter of what we're measuring. So most of this literature looks at these very big aggregated indicators of government human rights practices. So you can think of things like the political terror scale or the Syria Human Rights Index, for example. But I agree, and I believe strongly that the way that governments respond, especially in the short run, tends to be much more focused on these kind of like basic governance reforms or adoption and who they're targeting in human rights. And those things don't necessarily get reflected quickly or easily in these more aggregated measures that tend to be more the product of bureaucratic processes and tend to be slow changing. Right. So I think that addressing both these selection issues and these measurement challenges is important to kind of resolving this debate or at least moving it forward. So that's what I try and do in this paper. So I'm going to leverage some design-based causal inference. We're going to be looking at a specific mechanism known as universal periodic review and trying to assess whether or not it shapes government human rights practices. So the overall question here is going to be, does international monitoring affect government human rights practices? So first is kind of the organization of the talk. I'll go through my overview. I'll provide kind of the high level argument and findings. So in case you stop paying attention for the rest of it, you'll get the main points. I'll then dig into my theoretical argument. And I'll contrast my argument with those that are existing in the literature, the two that I just briefly noted. I'll then turn to the data and research design. I'll explain how I'm going to assess my argument relative to the alternatives. And then I'll kind of plow through the empirical findings. We'll conclude with some takeaways, both for researchers and public policy practitioners. All right, so there's going to be two concepts. One is this idea of international monitoring, and I'm going to be looking specifically at this mechanism of universal periodic review. And so what this is it's global, meaning that every country that's a member of the UN General Assembly has participated in this process since 2008. And they all undergo a periodic review once every 4.5 years or so, in which they send their delegates to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and their delegates are kind of cross-examined by other state delegates. So they'll get called out for various human rights violations. And there's also a process by which NGOs, international treaty bodies, can submit reports and documentations of rights abuses prior to the review actually occurring. So that's going to be my core kind of explanatory or independent variable. And then we're going to look at a wide variety of outcomes. So we'll look at both human rights practices. I'll share some results on these aggregated measures, as well as a new measure that's new since the draft that you read that looks specifically at reprisals that governments have taken toward individuals and civil society organizations that engage with the UN human rights system. And then I'll also look at a variety of different accountability measures that states can implement to begin to deal with past human rights abuse. And this is all drawn from a large data collection effort that I've done with Jeff Dancy and Catherine Sinkink. We have a whole website called transitionaljustice.data.org that you should check out. So my arguments here is what I'll refer to as institutionally constrained reactivity. I welcome nicer names. I find myself very stuck in the jargon of the social sciences. But so the idea here, I think, is actually pretty simple. So the notion is that states respond strategically to monitoring, and they want to do so in two ways. One is that they want to signal that they're going to behave in ways that are consistent with the expectations of international law and international monitors, right? They want to show that they're making some reforms that they're to signal their type that they're human rights compliant. But at the same time, they don't like getting caught doing bad things. So they're going to try and kind of bury under the rug or suppress information about their own transgressions, right? So they kind of do this dance between trying to do some positive things and then at the same time trying to guard against future accusations of abuse. And so but the constrained component here is that I argue that all states aren't able to do this equally. So kind of counterintuitively relative to what exists in the out there in the human rights literature, I argue that states where there's really weak rule of law or executive are less constrained by the judiciary or the courts. They have more flexibility in terms of quickly implementing these reforms or engaging in reprisals and the like in response to international monitoring. Whereas you might think that democratic institutions, for example, or democratic states have a much longer process to be able to implement policies. So I'm going to test this argument using new data. So I've already mentioned the data, but we will have a variety of measures of human rights accountability. And then I've built this new data set here with an RA at Cornell on the issuance of reprisals against people that collaborate with the UN. And then we're going to be leveraging the random assignment of Universal Periodic Review's review dates. So they actually held a lottery in 2007, and they've used that lottery to decide and determine when states will go under review. So we're going to leverage that to try and back out the effect of peer review. And what we're going to find is kind of a mixed bag. So we'll see that monitoring increases the likelihood that states will release political prisoners and that they'll initiate new prosecutions of their own officials for past human rights violations. But at the same time, we'll see some evidence that they also behave in a way that I argue is consistent with information suppression. So they're going to scale back the creation of truth commissions, which is a very common way that states will document their own histories. And they're also going to engage in a big increase in these kind of targeted reprisals against the activists that are engaging with the UN system. And then these effects I'll show are really much greater and driven by states where there's low rule of law. And so the big picture idea here is that international monitoring is kind of this countervailing effects on government human rights practices. I'm still kind of wrestling with whether or not this is normatively a good story, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. The first findings I came across were these on political prisoners, and so the earlier framing of the paper was much more optimistic. And then as I've dug more into the data, I find more evidence of these kind of more nefarious outcomes like the reprisals. But at the very least, the evidence is consistent with the monitoring having a big impact on government behavior. Matt?
So countervailing just means that some go in one direction and some go in the other, more contradictory or inconsistent? Or...
Yeah, inconsistent. I had mixed here earlier. I thought countervailing sounded better. But yeah, so I guess like I'm trying to square the circle between we see some reforms, like the release of political prisoners, I think is objectively a good thing, right? But then reprisals are not. And I think it's all consistent with governments responding in this very strategic way to abuse.
I hope this is clarification, kind of. Are you worried about non-random patterns of missingness in the reprisals data? Because I would think there would be.
Oh, yes. We can talk about the reprisals data a bunch. So I've done this. We can hold this if you will until the discussion after.
Please do.
Yeah, and I think that, yes, I'll table that for now. All right, so let's move on to my argument. So just to provide some more of the nuts and bolts. So I build my argument by drawing on this literature in international relations that looks at these kind of global performance indicators. So this is research by Edith Kelly and Beth Simmons. They have a special issue in IO where there's a whole bunch of papers that look at these indicators. So these could be things like measurements by Transparency International about corruption and how they affect the way that governments allocate their resources. So they argue that these global indicators produce social pressure that operates through three different mechanisms. So there's this idea that you have transnational pressure, domestic mobilization, and elite shaming. And I argue that even though UPR is a monitoring effort, they don't necessarily produce like numeric values of whether or not states are complying, that it operates in the same way, that all three of these mechanisms are at least plausibly related to the way that UPR might affect government practice. So for transnational pressure, the reporting process involves both like transnational advocacy organizations submitting reports, so like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all submit reports as part of the reporting process that feed in to the basis by which the individual reviews are conducted. It also is a pretty big impact on domestic politics. So in the paper, I show that there's actually an increase in Google searches of human rights when Universal Periodic Review is going on. And there's a pretty large literature, this goes back to some of Beth's earlier research, about how international human rights law can really serve as a basis for the mobilization of lawyers and legal movements within, right? And we can see aspects of these things through the UPR reporting process. But I think what's really driving, and this is a difference between what I submitted to you all to read and the paper as it's being revised, as I do more research, I think what's really driving the effects that I'm seeing here are about elite shaming, right? So when countries anticipate that they're going to come under international scrutiny, they're more likely to try and adapt to lessen the pressure that they might experience due to this shame. And elite shaming is really kind of baked into the design of the way that UPR works, right? So a state has to send their own delegates who represent them, during UPR, they have this thing called interactive dialogue, which is this about 3.5 hour exchange where the delegate first provides a presentation, and then all the other delegates from the other countries in the UNGA have an opportunity to issue comments. And this process is taken quite seriously. So I think on average, there's about 150 comments or recommendations made to each state during UPR. So it's pretty lively debate. And then the delegates have to respond on the spot. So they have to give like a short presentation responding to the criticisms and critiques that they've received. So states respond strategically to the social pressure. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think that their ability to do so is really inhibited by kind of bureaucratic constraints. And I'd say there's two parts to this. So on the one hand, I think there's reasons why we shouldn't anticipate these more aggregated measures of human rights to change. And this is because kind of like misgovernance and principal agent problems are really rife in the area of human rights. So if you think of something like abuse happening at Abu Ghraib during the Iraq War, like this is abuse being conducted by the United States. It's a high functioning, it's a high capacity government, for example. And the Department of Defense and the CIA at the time were trying to interrogate people either at CIA black sites or at Guantanamo. And nevertheless, these practices kind of matriculated out and arrived in an unauthorized place in a prison being run by the DoD in Iraq. Right. So even in the case of the United States, you have these kind of like misgovernance and principal agents problems that can kind of like perpetuate and fuel persistent human rights violations. So I think this is a key reason why kind of like getting these international monitoring efforts to impact these more aggregate measures is somewhat unlikely. And then there's the issue of legal constraints that I've already mentioned. So in places where the executives have autonomy, you'd expect them to be a little bit more adaptable and responsive to changes in elite shaming and social pressure. So I draw a number of implications out from this argument. So one is that we'd expect monitoring to have kind of heterogeneous effects on the implementation of these human rights accountability mechanisms. So we'd expect them to cause states to engage in, to implement some reforms to signal their willingness to comply, but at the same time kind of scale back other efforts that might produce the disclosure of more information. Right. So later on, when I actually operationalize this, I'll draw a distinction between amnesties and human rights prosecutions versus truth commissions. And then at the same time, we'd expect a lot of this is driven by efforts to suppress information. So later on, when I do my analysis, I'll contrast kind of effects on reprisals versus effects on these more aggregated human rights measures. And then we'd expect there to be some variation in the effect size based on the degree to which elite policymakers are free from legal constraints. Any questions on this? All right. So then the alternative explanations, which I previewed in my opening, are really this, as I'll call them, the optimists and the critics again. So the more optimistic account is that monitoring increases the costs of noncompliance and also produces these more like socializing effects that teach states best practices. And that generally produces the improvement of human rights. And this is especially the case. So this is kind of the opposite of my argument, right? Where you would expect these effects to be greatest when there's more robust domestic rule of law, right? So in cases or contexts where domestic activists and lawyers are more empowered, they have a stronger institutional framework in which to contest government policies, you'd expect the effect of monitoring to be greater. And then the kind of pushback against those claims comes from what I'll refer to as the critics' account. And this is just that monitoring is really ineffective because it produces either backlash or intransigence. And we shouldn't expect it to really have a positive effect. And perhaps it could even have a negative effect on government human rights practices. All right, so now let's turn to my data and research design. So I'm going to test these different arguments using a panel of country years from 2008 through 2020. So UPR first gets implemented in 2008, and then I have my outcome variables through 2020. That kind of defines the study period. So the first set of outcome measures that we'll look at are what I'll refer to as accountability measures. And these are all from this transitional justice evaluation tools data set. which is all available online if you'd like to look at it. And in the data set, there are 137 amnesty policies that are implemented during the study period. There's about 2,600 domestic human rights prosecutions and 34 truth commissions that are created. So the data set allows me to kind of disentangle amnesties in a few different ways. So we can look at amnesties that are for government officials versus for opposition figures. We can look at amnesties that are specifically for past human rights violations. So the main results I show will be for general amnesties for opposition figures, and we'll contrast it with amnesties for government officials for past human rights violations. And then, yeah, that's the main differences that I'll draw from the transitional justice data set. But all of these are going to be kind of binary outcomes, right? So is there any amnesty in this year, or is there none? Does the government begin doing human rights prosecutions or not? And then for human rights practices, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of begin with a broad measure. So I'll be using the State Respect for Human Rights measure that's developed by Chris Ferris. So this is a latent variable measure that kind of compiles both mass atrocity crimes and things like torture and extrajudicial killing and disappearances into one like aggregate number that varies across states over time. And then we'll kind of narrow in, specifically focusing on the repression of civil society. We'll use the VDEMS measure for this. And then we'll turn to reprisals, which I drew from these reports that are published by the UN Secretary General. And so the notion is that we're trying to home in on the specific act of information suppression that could be occurring in response to that. So I mentioned that I'll leverage the lottery that they use to roll out a universal periodic review. I guess from a scientific perspective, they did quite a good job in implementing this institution. It actually makes it quite useful for trying to address these kind of debates within the literature. So the lottery was, I want to say they did the lottery in December 2007, but my memory could be a little bit foggy on that. They actually block randomized by region, which is fantastic because region correlates with lots of other determinants of human rights practices. You can think of things like level of economic development, even what democracy tends to be pretty clustered by region. And so that helps a lot in terms of like the kind of the strength of the test. And then they imposed these rules on if you had been elected to the UN Human Rights Council in 2007, then you're expected to go first. So I'll show that I have supplementary analyses showing that that doesn't really make a difference. But I argue that that's kind of exogenous or unrelated to the government's human rights practices because they had already lobbied to get onto the UN Human Rights Council. And then this rule was established once they were already there. So the core assumption here is just that the timing of review is independent of our outcomes. So this is kind of an example of the actual timing. And so in the results that I'll present here, we're just going to look at the effect of the actual observed review. But in my appendix, I run all of these sensitivity analyses in which, because we actually have the rule book by which they conducted this lottery, we can replicate this lottery thousands of times and compare the estimates that we get with the actual observed data to all of these fictitious lotteries, right? So this is an idea in statistics called randomization inference. So I do a lot of that to kind of test the sensitivity of my results. And the lottery, as you might expect, produces incredibly well-balanced set of kind of control and treated states or states that are under review. So this is just a simple plot that shows kind of the standardized mean difference between states that are under review versus those that are not. So this is its approach to balanced test that was developed by Aaron Hartman and Danny Hidalgo called equivalence test. But the upshot, the thing that really matters is that they argue that the kind of like a 0.36 standard deviation is where you begin to get worried. And you can see that the differences here between shown by the black diamonds is that the groups are essentially identical. Like there's very small differences in terms of like the standardized mean difference across these different attributes. So I view this as pretty strong evidence that the randomization works. All right, so I'll present estimates using, I guess my main set of results will all be these kind of like two-way fixed effects models. in which our main outcome is going to be this tau, right? So this is going to estimate the effect of review on our different outcomes. We'll include country and year fixed effects. So this isn't necessary. You can replicate the results with it, but including some like pre-treatment covariates and some controls helps with the precision of the estimates, which is why I do it. And then we'll control for log GDP per capita, log population, kind of countries, UNGA voting ideal points, which has become pretty standard measure in the literature to identify countries' policy preferences. For the analyses in which the outcomes are accountability measures, we'll also include controls for human rights and whether or not the country is, or the degree to which a country is electoral democracy. And then I'm going to conduct analyses in which I arbitrarily move forward the actual year of review by 1, 2, or 3 years, and then lag it 2 or 3 years as well to see if there's any evidence that states are changing their practices in anticipation of review or after review has actually occurred, right? So because the lottery was set in 2007, states know when they're going to go up for review. So we might expect that they're anticipating and adapting strategically to it. And in fact, that's like a core part of my theoretical argument as well. And then I mentioned I'll do sensitivity analysis just by replicating the lottery a whole bunch of times. I won't present those during the presentation, but they're in the paper and I've got slides on them. And then we'll also do a series of interaction models in which in order to assess this idea that that institutional constraints affect the degree to which states respond reactively to UPR. Any questions about the basic research design and statistics? All right. I love that stuff, so I'll just happy to talk about it. All right, so let's start with the accountability measures. So these are kind of like the top line results that are presented in the paper. Start with amnesties on the top row, and then we've got truth commissions on the lower left and an indicator for whether or not states are initiating domestic human rights trials on the bottom. I should say these are always trials of government agents for past human rights violations. And we can see that it causes a statistically significant increase in the number of opposition amnesties. And at the same time, governments scale back whether or not they're issuing amnesties to their own officials for past human rights violations. So I find these findings quite compelling and consistent with this argument that they're responding reactively, right? Like amnesties for your own officials are bad in terms of human rights compliance. It's an instance of impunity, whereas releasing people that you've imprisoned for political reasons is generally seen as a positive change. But then we see that there's also this effect on truth commissions. So you can run the data a bunch of ways. I want to say that like there's only one truth commission that is actually created when a country is under review, which is kind of like a remarkably strong, or I should say very unlikely outcome given the way that it's randomized. So I think this is quite a strong finding. And then there's also this uptick in domestic human rights prosecutions. So I view this as evidence is broadly consistent with this idea that states are trying to do some things to show that they're being responsive to international scrutiny, but at the same time trying to withhold some changes that might make them vulnerable to accusations of abuse in the future. And it's quite hard to square these with either the critics or optimistic account, right? Because they wouldn't expect there to be these countervailing or mixed results in the data. They'd expect either uniform increases or null effects or worse. And that's simply not the case. So now turning to human rights practices. So the top row here are these more aggregated measures, right? Which look at things like Ferris's measure, as I mentioned before, which is in the upper left, combines things like whether or not there is mass atrocity crimes along with extrajudicial killings and the like. The civil society repression from VDOM. So this is a survey of experts asking whether or not there is specific laws and policies being implemented to curtail or limit the participation of civil society organizations in public life more generally. And then the reprisals, these are the outcomes that I'm quoting from the UN Secretary General reports. So I think that this is consistent with kind of these broader issues of like the extent to which kind of misgovernance and principal agent problems change or limit the effects of monitoring on these more aggregated outcomes. But then we see when it's specific to the targeting of individuals that collaborate with the UN human rights system, that there tends to be a pretty big effect in terms of governments being responsive to international monitoring. Any questions? All right. So now I'll show some results on kind of like the conditional effects, and then I'll provide some illustrative evidence from the actual UN documentation that I've been using, and then we can wrap up and have conversation. All right, so in all of these, so this is using the VDEM's judicial constraints on the executive index, and we're just estimating the effect. So these are different than the results that I presented in the paper that you all read. So in the paper, I was using these more flexible kernel estimates, which I personally like. Reviewers at the journal were like, these are too complicated, do something that we all understand. So that's what I'm doing here. So these are just like linear interaction models. So you can see how the effect varies in a linear manner across. And then the vertical black lines are these binning estimates. So essentially what the binning estimates are doing is it's looking at each tertile or each third of the judicial constraints on the executive and estimating the effect of UPR within that subgroup, right? And so I think that perhaps the binning estimates here for opposition amnesties are not statistically significant, but you can see that the general trend across all four of these analyses is that the effect is really driven by countries in which there are very few judicial constraints on executive decision, right? So I think that this is quite consistent with my argument about how limited restraints allow states to be more responsive to international monitoring. And then we see a very similar pattern when we look at the human rights outcomes. Right, so across respect for human rights and civil society repression, we see that there's really not much in effect. I should mention here, so the VDEM index, positive values are actually better. So what VDEM is indicating here, if you want to read much into this, is actually that if anything, they're indicating that things are getting better on the left-hand side of the judicial constraints index. But then in the reprisals data, we see that it's completely the opposite. That really the uptick in reprisals is driven entirely by these states that have few legal constraints on the executive. All right, so I'll just provide some quick illustrative evidence. So two cases in which countries actually highlight the release of political prisoners during a universal periodic review, and then two cases of reprisals. So this is from Israel's presentation during UPR in 2013. So in that case, it was actually the first time, although not the last, because the US just skipped universal periodic review. So in 2013 was the first time that a country refused to show up to its review, which prompted a months-long effort by the international community to get Israel to show back up, which they eventually did on October 20th. And as part of their presentation, at the time there were negotiations going on between the US and Israel and Palestine about the ongoing conflict that's going on in that country. It's been for a long time. And at the review in Geneva, the Israeli delegation actually announced that they were going to be releasing, I think it was 26 more political prisoners that day, right? So they actually waited until the timing of universal periodic review to announce that they were going to be releasing political prisoners.
And did they arrest?
They released 20.
Did they arrest after the date?
Oh, after the date?
Of course.
Good question. I don't have data on that. And I would say if I don't have data on like arrests, but this would be an indication of like a lagged effect, right? If we're concerned that they're just doing kind of like window dressing reforms, and then we'd expect them just to kind of like revert back to their preferred policy once monitors have reverted their clothes. So I have some evidence using other people's measures of reprisals that happens with reprisals, but for most of my other measures, I haven't been able to find evidence of that. But I would suspect that there are certainly cases where it's pretty cut and dry that they do something in the short term and then immediately revert back to the abuses they were doing. I have another example from Albania, which I won't read carefully because I'm already getting to time. But so they actually implemented an amnesty law in the month before their review in 2014. And then here's two cases of reprisal. So I think that both of these are pretty provide strong indication that the intent of these reprisals is really for information suppression. So there's one person who's a professor, journalist, and human rights defender in Djibouti. And after he returned from Geneva, where he had presented information as part of the pre-sessions to Universal Periodic Review, he returned home and the Secret Service raided his home. And then they took his passport and prohibited him from being able to travel. And this happened immediately when he was planning to go to Geneva for the Universal Periodic Review. And then I think another case, which is potentially even more alarming. So there's another Douglas Luongo, I believe is how you say his name, who's the executive director for the United Association for Peace and Development in Uganda. So like the case in Djibouti, he had traveled to Geneva to participate in these pre-sessions in which NGOs were beginning to coordinate and provide information to monitors in Geneva prior to Uganda undergoing its periodic review. And then when he returned home, a group of armed men showed up to his house, had him and his family go to one room, and then they confiscated all the documents that he had brought back from Geneva about the UPR process. So that, to me, is pretty decidedly pointing toward the fact that the motivation here was about dealing with UPR. And then a few days later, a man, Mr. Luongo heard a man moaning on his front steps, went outside, found him unconscious, took him to the hospital, and then the Ugandan authorities arrested him and charged him with manslaughter, which is quite alarming. I guess in a follow-up case a year later, so the UN Secretary General follows up on this, and the Ugandan courts ultimately released him on bail. And then I believe the case was ultimately dismissed because he's still active. But nevertheless, it signals the extent to which the government, or these armed men at least, were trying to, prohibit or stop his collaboration with the UN human rights system. All right, so then the takeaways here. So for social science, I think that my theory and kind of methodological approach to these debates helps advance these kind of long-standing disputes amongst the critics and the more optimistic accounts of the impact of international monitoring on government human rights practices. I believe that this concept of reactivity and the notion that countries that have fewer restraints is kind of, I don't want to say corrective, but it provides an alternative perspective for how we might think about the role of domestic institutions in shaping states' responses to international legal efforts, right? So we've got a well-established body of research about how domestic institutions can be very important for legal efforts. And here I'm showing that kind of the opposite seems to be the case, in which there are fewer restraints. You actually see more responsiveness to international monitoring in some respects. And I think it's also notable that that we're able to kind of link the effects of monitoring to these very specific transitional justice policies that are seen in the literature as kind of first steps to addressing legacies of violence and abuse. So for policymakers, I think just the upshot of the finding that UPR does appear to impact state behavior is quite important. So much of the literature on UPR specifically really views it as hyper politicized and kind of just like a place where states go and like praise their friends and chastise their foes. And it's really not much good for any actual outcomes on the ground. So at the very least, I'm showing here that it does have a big impact on outcomes on the ground, but whether or not it works in terms of advancing human rights, I think the story is much more complex, right? So clearly, I think that cases of political opposition figures being released, prosecution of state agents for past human rights abuses, those could be viewed or argued as instances of the advancement of human rights. But these cases of reprisals like in Uganda, and Djibouti, for example, are quite worrisome and need to be taken seriously. So I'd be curious to know how you all think through how to balance these kind of like competing findings and what the normative implications of it all are. So that's all I have for now. I look forward to all